What is up, guys? Lord Nick here, bringing you another One Piece related video. This video, guys, is going to be our obligatory once per set, tier list. So, this tier list, we're going to actually build it as the whole video, so that's going to be fun. That being said, I did cut out some of the middleman here by starting off with some of the stuff that we just don't really need to go over why it's there. These are all of our 4 fun decks, more or less. If you want to play them, have fun with them, you can do that. These are not ones that I think are going to be terribly meta-defining, nor do I think any of these are really going to have a high chance of performing extremely well in this coming meta. Not to say that you can't possibly pop off at a regional, and get top 32 with something like this, but I don't think any of these really stand a chance of doing anything outrageously good, and even if they try to, there's other decks that might be able to accomplish it more. The exception being kind of these decks in the first row here. Bello Betty does get support this set, but I think OP10 is really going to be where she's going to have the best chance of popping off again. Purple Kaido has shown some resilience of being useful here or there. That being said, I just think Ploofy is just by far the better purple deck right now. So let's just kind of, and then as for the don't play these are just decks that are objectively so bad that you should just avoid touching them. They're either unsynergistic with themselves, their ability is just wonky and not actually that good, or they're just a neutered version of something that doesn't have enough support for it, even with support cards being printed this set. So let's jump into the actual tier list itself. S tier will be our meta definers. I really see maybe 2 decks kind of being that. A tier are going to be our ones that kind of keep up and compose the rest of the meta, ones that are answering these 2 meta definers and or answering the answers to the meta definers. Our rogue decks are decks that can come in because they have a good matchup into a lot of this A tier and maybe even some of these S tier decks. And stand a chance to do really well in this meta if piloted properly and well. I don't think that these ones are strong enough to stand out as like ones that people should all play, but if people take the time to learn them and master them, these will be a couple of decks that will probably be pretty good. And then starting to cook, this is kind of sorry. They're on the verge of going into rogue tier. I wouldn't say they're necessarily like competitively viable, but they are on the fringe of being able to do something. Or they're brand new decks, and so we might actually have something pop up with these decks that allows them to just kind of show up out of nowhere. Realistically, a lot of people probably would put Rebecca here. I'm not realistic, so I'm gonna copium a little bit there. But let's start off with who I think our meta decks are, and I don't think it's going to come at any surprise. I think Dofi being our number 1 deck in format, it's not really a big surprise to anyone. Pretty much everybody assumed this, and still assumes this, to my knowledge. It just is a very good deck, and you have to be able to play around Dofi. If you do not, then you will stand to lose to Dofi, and there's going to be enough of them showing up that if you lose to every Dofi you see, you're just going to not do well in a tournament. The next guy going up on our list is actually Blackbeard. I have been seeing a lot of folks putting him in A tier. They really don't know if to rank him higher than that. I think that Blackbeard has enough strength in the fact that he can turn off on plays and the fact that he has some pretty strong combos and draw power in the deck that enables him to be something that people actually have to respect and worry about. So because of this, I think that he is also would be in my categorization as a meta definer. I don't think that there is another deck that is as strong as these 2 in terms of being able to set the pacing that you have to be able to answer these decks. And because of this, our next one is actually going to be a little bit of surprise, and so that's why I want to talk about it next, and that's going to be Lucci. And I'm putting him in Rogue. There's a lot of people that are going to argue he needs to be an A or that he needs to be an S, that Lucci is still such a good deck that we need to be respecting that, and that needs to be the case and point of, like, why is Lucci not, being considered higher. So I think he goes down to Rogue, not necessarily because he doesn't have the viability to be A or that he doesn't have the viability to be S, but because there is such a hard stopgate to him in the meta that there is this is such a losing matchup for him. This is a 50-50 matchup for Lucci most of the time. This is a straight losing matchup for Lucci. And prior to this, Lucci has had a straight losing matchup prior to this set. Or at least not in this sense. But, like, he's in a bad spot in comparison to where he has been. Not to say that he's bad, not to say that he's even going to be completely unseen in the meta. I think he's still going to be very seen and very prevalent. We really hate to give up on this deck here on the West, so I think he will be here pretty regularly. That being said, I think that he falls more into a rogue, and I think that's just being, if he sees more Dophies, he has a better chance. If your Lucci sees a lot of Blackbeard's probably going to win out. So just because of that, I think he's down here, not because his strength doesn't enable him to be here or anything else. He can just destroy everything in A tier, which is what he's done so far. But these two decks are strong. Plouffe gets stronger, which Lucci does beat Plouffe usually. But also, Black-Yellow Luffy is still around. And yes, it needs to be careful about how it plays into Blackbeard, but it is still a strong deck. And now there's two decks that Lucci struggles into. So let's talk about the next guy, Black-Yellow Luffy. Where does he fall in the meta? I actually think that he's still in A tier. And the reason I think he's still in A tier is because he can kind of just feast on Dofi. It is very difficult for Dofi to deal with a 9k leader every single turn. And so making yourself a 9k leader requires him to put so much Dawn investment into his characters to kill you that it is dang near impossible for him to do so. And if you are able to stay at 1 life, if you can get the cycle going properly where you have 1 life, you keep it around, and then you start doing the 2 life combo, so you get into 2 life, keeping an extra card in life, Dofi's never going to be able to kill you. Which then means that you were just going to overrun him and beat him up. Yes, your Blackbeard matchup is going to be bad, like every other black deck. You're going to struggle into Blackbeard, but you still feast on pretty much everybody else in the meta. You have a fairly solid, if not 50-50-ish matchup with, and you do really well into one of the other ones. I think that this deck still stays in the A tier, despite the fact that it's not getting anything that's making this deck overwhelmingly insane. But it doesn't get to be near the competition of S tier like it had been in before, where I kind of considered this deck kind of be one of the top 3 decks in the meta. I don't necessarily hold it in regards of being a top 3 anymore, but I do believe that it is still an A tier, whereas with Lucci, just having 2 S tier decks that are 50-50 or below win rate wise just makes it really rough for him. Let's move into Plouffe. Plouffe is the next big dog in the meta because everybody wants to talk about him. Well, Plouffe is probably the top of A tier. A lot of good support going out with all of the stuff that's supposed to be for purple-black Luffy. All the purple stuff really just goes into Plouffe and makes this deck way more consistent, way more of a problem, way stronger of a deck, and its matchup into Dofi is really, really good. That being said, I'm not 100% sure how its matchup into Blackbeard's going to go. And its matchup into some of the other A tier decks makes it so that it can struggle, which is why it doesn't get to move up to an S tier, but it is still a really strong deck that is close to forcing people to have to play around it some. If not, strategy-wise, you kind of play around it by the way that you play around Dofi to a degree, so you just got to be a little more cautious of that. And if you can handle some slightly bigger bodies than the Dofi, you should be okay into it. It is also a little bit more of a... It also punches itself a little bit more than Dofi does in the fact that it has to take its own life to start trying to get in its advantage, which does mean that you have some type of comeback. You have some potential of being able to just overrun them if they play it badly. So let's see. Where else are we at here? Who else is in the meta? Well, let's talk about Enel, because Enel, I think, is in an interestingly weird spot. This deck was a arguable A tier this last set, just due to the fact that its matchup into Dofi was so good. But a lot of its power is on play. And going into a deck that then says we turn off on plays can be very frustrating. And the fact that this deck was good into everything else, but not great into anything else, and it was pretty dang good at feasting on Dofis. Yes, Dofis will still be there, but we have a deck that now will, just like Lucci, will just dominate you. Your matchup into Black-Yellow Luffy isn't getting any better. Your matchup into Plouffe is probably getting worse. So ultimately, I would say this deck kind of falls down a little bit more. and I'm being nice by saying it's Rogue. I'm keeping it probably towards the bottom of Rogue, but it was a meta-ish deck, so we kind of needed to place it. Where's Bonnie? Bonnie. There you are, Bonnie. Let's talk about Bonnie. Bonnie's in an odd spot. So Bonnie does really well into Plouffe. Bonnie does okay into Dofi. It can get very overwhelmed. Bonnie does have some on-play abilities, quite a few on-play abilities in its top end, so that means that the Blackbeard matchup, again, is going to be relatively bad for this deck. Sorry about all the coughing. I've had a persistent cough for 3 weeks, and I don't know how to get rid of it. No other symptoms, just a cough. It's been very annoying. And the more I talk, the more often it coughs. So Bonnie then also has to look at, well, what are its other matchups like? Well, its matchup into Black Yellow Luffy is still pretty favorable to Bonnie. Its matchup into Plouffe is still okay. I wouldn't say great. Its matchup into Dofi is okay. Its matchup into Lucci is pretty mediocre-ish. Not terrible, but not ideal. And its matchup into Enel is pretty solid. So far of the decks that we are kind of rating, Bonnie's pretty middle of the line. But that being said, her not knowing how bad her matchup is going to be into Blackbeard, I'm putting her towards A. There is a lot of argument to move her into Rogue, but I think that she's still strong enough to kind of be in this A tier, just because that the deck itself has such a universally good leader ability that I don't really think that it would fall down like these two. Yes, Enel's and Lucci's abilities are both generically very, very strong for their archetypes, but they each actually have enough suffering matchups into Blackbeard, Black Yellow Luffy, and Plouffe in and of themselves that both of these are falling down some. Bonnie does pretty good into Black Yellow Luffy from a lot of what my local scene has been showing, and she does relatively well into Dofi. Not perfect, but okay. I do imagine that she could still do something into Blackbeard because of the fact that she can rest a character every turn. Yes, Tenbeard is going to be kind of annoying for her. But maybe she can do well. I honestly just don't know what to anticipate with that matchup. It seems like it would be pretty Blackbeard favored, but let's talk about some of the other decks here as well to kind of just confirm it. Nami, I'm just putting Nami in Rogue at this point. I don't think Nami is meta-defining, but I don't think Nami's out of the meta. I think she's just there. She's going to have a chance to put top here or there, and a good Nami player is just going to be able to find a way. And sometimes it's just they're going to RNG out some games and win. So that being said, they're in the meta, but I'm not going to really define too much about it. So I actually want to talk about the weird one that has popped up in our current meta, which was Vegapunk, where I said, oh yeah, Vegapunk's going to be really good in the 8 meta. I was wrong. He didn't do too much in the 8 meta. But I was also not super wrong, because as we got into 8.5, he got to add in 4 cards. And those 4 cards actually did a lot for speeding up the tempo of the deck, and made it this turbo yellow aggro deck that is hella frustrating for a lot of people to deal with. Which is where I think that this deck is actually pretty solid. Do I think that it holds up in this next set? I don't know. I honestly don't play it enough to know where it's going to hold up, but I am going to be nice enough to Vegapunk and put it in Rogue because I think that it is showcased in the 8.5 that it can come out of nowhere and actually just do really well. Going 9-0 in a tournament to win the tournament is enough for me to be like, maybe this deck needs to stick around a bit. Or maybe it can stick around a bit. Maybe not that it needs to, but it can. All right, so Marco. Marco's also going in Rogue. Marco, I think, is actually better than people expected it to be. And with a lot of different builds kind of popping up, especially here in Austin, our meta is popping up with a ton of Marcos and different builds thereof. I think this deck actually hangs relatively okay as a control deck, but it does rely on a lot of on-plays, so its matchup, again, Blackbeard kind of determining that. And I think that it does get a little bit more struggling into the ones that are kind of sticking in the A tier. These are a bit more of a struggle matchup for him, whereas he can do relatively well into Dofi, as there are ways that you can build Marco to just kind of feast on Dofi. But it does make it struggle into the A's and some of the other rogues, so he's kind of falling down to where Vegapunk is, which is going to be the bottom of it. Now, King, Carrot, and Pudding, I'm going to be putting into the starting to cook category. So, these decks were solid-ish. throughout the meta. King, kind of the worst of the bunch, didn't really do much. Carrot didn't also really do much, but showcased that she actually had some pretty okay matchups into some of these decks, which is pretty astonishing, in my opinion, the fact that this is a leader that could do well. But the fact that you could just rest basically anything for free in a meta that is very much dominated by 4 and 5 drops is very, very, very nice to have. And I think that it is possible that Carrot could be something for if played properly by a good enough pair of hands. As for the King, I think it is kind of gimmicky. I don't think it's bad, and I think it has a really epic pool of cards that it can pull off of. But I don't think it's, like, insane. And so I'm kind of leaving these guys down below Rogue tier. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody shows up in a top 32 with these decks, but I don't think they will. As for Pudding does get a couple more tools in the yellow cards that we get the set, and some of the purple cards maybe. I don't know. Playing a deck that just dominates Pudding, I don't see this deck really coming into the meta, especially when there is a floodgate of stop your on-play effects. Zero. I want to put Zero in Rogue, so I'm going to put Zero in Rogue. And I think he's slightly better than these two decks. I think that the Zero build is actually really solid. It does have a lot of on-play, but it also has just a lot of tempo in and of itself, and it has a lot of cards that are just generic rush cards that is not an on-play effect. So you can leader ability, pump those out there, and just start smacking face into something like Blackbeard. And Blackbeard can't do a whole lot about that, as, you know, rushing him down might be a route. That being said, because of that, I have learned the power of this stupid-ass deck of Sanji. I hate this deck. I hate playing into this deck. It is not fun. It is more fun than Nami, but it's not fun to just have to constantly be like, all right, did I draw enough early 2Ks and board clear presence? And then you try to choke him out and he takes his own life anyways. Annoying deck. Is it broken? No. Is it God tier? No. Do I think that this stands to be a deck that we will see a lot of? Yes. Why? I think that the West likes to Unga Bunga a lot more than the East. So this is going to be your chief Unga Bunga deck. I don't want to say it's A tier, but it is definitely better than what I anticipated this deck being, based off the fact that it didn't really seem to show up in the East almost at all. Law, he gets to be in our starting to cook, because you can't disrespect the old guy. Smoker gets to be top of starting to cook, kind of bottom of Rogue. I think he falls off. His matchup into Dofi's been okay. His matchup into other black decks has been pretty solid, and he still has a decent matchup into Black Yellow Luffy, I guess. That being said, I think that he had his time. We're about to go into a really oddball meta for him, and the fact that we can turn off so many on plays is going to ruin his ability for maintaining a hand and some of his ability to reduce the cost of things. So because of that, I think Smoker does fall down a bit. I think he was probably bottom of Ace, top of Rogue last set, and I think he falls down a bit, just kind of like how the other black decks fall down. I think he falls down a bit too. Newgate, I don't think we can count him out. Garp, I think, is spicy and has some anti-meta stuff. In that same vein, I think you can kind of do similar things with Sabo, maybe not as well. So, you know what, screw it. We'll put Sabo if you want to. Ace. I have seen enough Aces that I'm going to put him in Rogue. I think that Ace actually stands a chance to be a Rogue deck, just due to the fact that he has the ability to give himself double attack and KO something, which is at a relatively high cost of something to KO. I think that that's fine, and I think that Ace actually has some explosive power behind him, and the cards that came in the Whitebeard deck actually do help him out quite a bit. So I think there is an argument to be made that this deck is better than people have been expecting, but just people haven't played it in forever, so it's really just the Ace mains that can kind of talk for this deck, but we have a decent number of them here in Austin. I've gotten to see the power of this deck. It actually, of the red decks, I like playing into this one more because I feel like there's a lot more like, dang, there's so many options of what he could play, so it's a bit more of a back and forth type of thing, whereas something like Sanji, it's like, all right, he's going to play something that's just a stupidly bad card that's only good because he gives it rush, and it's broken because it has rush, so like that's just kind of the, or it's just a vanilla. It's just a big ass vanilla with rush. So, like, Ace, there's some nuance, and so because of that, I like it more. That being said, I would still say that Zero and Sanji are probably slightly better than him, but I would say he's actually probably the best of the Whitebeard variants. Katakuri also kind of falls into the starting to cook category for me. I think his deck is just too easily kind of figured out, right? Like early on, he's just going to smack you pretty hard as he can. If you can weather the storm, take some of those hits, and then as he starts going into the late game stuff, if you have answers to his late game, you're going to win. If you don't have answers to the late game, you're going to lose. If you can be more aggro than him, you might win. Like, there's so much stuff. I don't think he's bad by any means, but I don't think that he is at all getting to be in this meta-relevant style of decks. Green, purple, Dofi, he'll have his time in 10. Rebecca, I think Rebecca's in a weird spot. My heart wants me to put Rebecca up here, and so I'm going to put Rebecca slightly above these guys because I can cook this one. Maybe not this one. Maybe it goes like this. Maybe it goes. It's so weird because Rebecca beats like a lot of these decks, other than maybe this one and this one. But she does really well into what we've set up as our A tier, S tier, and what I kind of imagine our A tier, S tier looking like. Rebecca actually does really well into these, and arguably has an insanely good matchup into Blackbeard due to the fact that most of our stuff is activate main, and our characters get to come out with a pseudo rush to start attacking his rested characters on the turn they come out, which is not what he wants. On top of that, turning off my leader ability, all it does is give me the ability to start attacking with my leader. Which he doesn't necessarily want to do, because that gives me an extra person to kind of threaten his life with. So, there's that kind of fun stuff that can happen, and honestly, I think because of her matchups here, she can do well, but there's a couple of guys down in here that actually are a little bit annoying and are such a bad matchup for her that it could go relatively badly, so I'll leave her in Rogue to be good. Perona is in that starting to cook. I think she gets some hella good support this set, but I honestly just don't know what to expect. Kind of the same thing with Yamato. I think Reiju maybe is Rogue. She kind of feasts on Rebecca, but I don't really know who else she actually kind of paces up with. I feel bad for Gecko. Kind of want to move him into the if you want to top of. I just don't see him being all that great. Kind of same thing with Dragon. Dragon isn't terrible. His ability is actually very strong, and he has the ability to be an extremely aggressive and fast deck. But there's other red decks that do that better. Boa, I think, is sorely underrated. We have a couple of Boa players here in Austin, and I've just been really high on how I think this deck can perform. I'm putting her in Rogue to be a little bit more cautious of how I rate it because she does have quite a few on plays, but the ability to just constantly remove things and get draw power from that while being able to establish bodies is hella annoying for a lot of decks. And I think she could be a lot better in this meta, but she's just a deck that is hard to kind of play because you have to manage your hand size correctly. You have to manage your tempo correctly. You don't want to overexert too much power early into your opponent and become kind of a worse Dofi. But if you build her to what the deck wants to do, the deck is very, very potent. Foxy, my boy, well, we're putting him in starting to cook because I think by 10 he heats up. That 2K is actually possibly enough. I also think that he kind of sneaks in every now and then to just kind of mess with people, and I love that. Shanks. So where do I want to put Shanks? I'm going to put Shanks in A. I think Shanks is the epitome of what a red control deck will look like, and I love that. And I think that he is very, very strong in setting a pace, and he could be towards the middle or top. I think he's above Bonnie. I think that he can kind of just destroy so many of these rogues and A tier decks if piloted properly, or if he sees a great curve. That he is just so good at being able to be a nuisance in the meta. So I can't see him not being meta. Lim is in that waiting room. I think she is starting to cook. I think 10 is, again, going to be the set that makes her pop off. Buggy is waiting for that. Buggy is waiting for his promo card whenever or however we end up getting it here in the West. Once that happens, he can move up to Rogue, even to A tier. I just don't think he's that great right now. Not that he's bad or anything. I just don't think he's anywhere near as good as some of the other decks. Black Purple Luffy, I don't see being that amazing. Robin, I think is going to be towards the top of Rogue here. I would want to put her into A, but like just having a great leader ability does not necessarily always mean that you're going to be an insane deck. She has some great color combination options and some great deck options as well. But 4-life leader is always hard to rate, even with having such a strong ability of having Banish on all the time. Red Purple Luffy, I think, is bottom of A. I think that the deck gets really, really strong. And then the last one we're going to rate, because we're not touching this guy. We can't play him. Would be Black Luffy. I think that starter deck Luffy has fallen off. If anything, I think he's in starting to cook, kind of teetering down into the if you want to. But like, I just don't think that this is that good of a black deck. I think he was already kind of rogue to begin with, this 8.5. And like every other black deck, he's kind of been shuffled down. I'm not shuffling him down all the way to if you want to, because I think he still has some viability, but we're not in a black dominant meta. Yes, we have 2 black decks in the top here, but these 2 black decks play like no other real black deck, really. And so I think we're kind of entering into a meta where aggro and mid-range are going to be very strong. Control is going to be kind of in a weird spot outside of Shanks and Bonnie. Like these are 2 of our best control decks. But ultimately, I think that we're going to be kind of in a very wide meta. I think anything rogue and up has a chance of pulling off a win at a big tournament. Why do I think that Rebecca has that chance? Well, I think that Rebecca's matchups into some of these top guys is actually good enough to argue that point. Whereas something like Vegapunk has already proven that he can do it for out of nowhere. Marco, I think, has that potential. Ace has that potential. Like, all these decks have that potential to at least top 32, if not top 16, pretty regularly. Yes, Lucci has some argument to be up in A tier. Should he be up in A tier? I honestly don't know. I'm keeping... These are kind of like on watch of moving up type 4 decks here. But I think everything else is relatively where they should be for this coming meta. If you guys disagree with that, feel free to do so. Later this week, I'll try to get out a video that is more geared towards specifically to Rebecca. But until then, guys, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoy the video, and I hope to see you in the next one. Until then, have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful day. Bye, guys.